So today I'm going to take a look at this poster from April 2016. It was presented at a speech by the then Chancellor George Osborne as part of the campaign to stay in the EU, because that year there was going to be a referendum in June about whether we should stay in or leave the EU. Now the poster is particularly interesting because it's a good example of how conflating two not entirely dissimilar concepts can be used disingenuously for rhetorical purposes. And it's worth pointing out I'm only specifically talking about the poster itself, because George Osborne in his speech and in this treasury analysis here is actually a little bit more clear what it's about. But clearly the poster was designed to give a misleading impression. So we can see that the poster says that a cost to the UK families if Britain leaves the EU will be £4,300 a year. Now, to come to that figure, what they'd actually done is they'd done some economic forecasts over 15 years to determine what they think the GDP would be then if we'd have stayed in the EU, or if we'd have actually left the EU with some bilateral agreements, which is actually kind of what happened. Now the problem is here, what they've actually done is they've conflated GDP per household with household income. So the £4,300 is what they've actually done at the time, is that they've taken the forecast for GDP for leaving the EU compared to if we'd have stayed in the EU, and then divided that by the number of households. But of course the poster presents it as though each family is somehow going to be £4,300 a year worse off, which is clearly not the case, because household income is lower than GDP per household, and obviously every household is different anyway with its income. So it's worth pointing out actually that this BBC reality check is quite good, because they do point out somewhere further down that the actual number of households that was assumed was actually based on what they were in 2015 rather than what they would be in 15 years' time. Now that's clearly naughty, because what they're actually looking at is they're looking at what they think GDP would be in 15 years' time. So to calculate this figure, they should actually be using a projected number of households at that point. And typically there's over 100,000 houses built per year, so in 15 years you would expect, if that trend continues, then at least 1.5 million new homes, and quite possibly over 2 million. But the problem is this relies on economic forecasts, and I mean it's simply an exercise in absurdity to try and put a figure on GDP in 15 years' time. And I think the problem is that the way the Chancellor was talking about this, I'll actually add to the description a URL to a YouTube video of where the speech was given, is that they're effectively reifying the forecast, because we can actually see as well in here, it actually makes a very strong categorical statement where it says Britain will be worse off by £4,300 a year if Britain votes to leave the EU. But we know that economic forecasts, even for short-term periods of around a year, can be wrong, and it's not unusual for them to be rejigged after just a few months. So there is absolutely no way that you can put a figure on what GDP would be in 15 years' time. And of course you can't really know what the counterfactual of staying in the EU would have been. At best they could have said, well, we think that GDP will be lower as a result of leaving the EU, but it's the fact that they put a number on it and then disingenuously conflate this with household income that is the real problem. So I think there's several lessons that we can actually take away from this. I mean, the first one is that conflation is a rhetorical ploy. I mean, this is one particular example, but I'm pretty sure it's been used in other places by different people in different contexts. Certainly politicians I think, in general, it's reasonable to assume that they're actually not acting in good faith, whichever side of a debate that they're on. And I think this is a particularly good example. Clearly there are examples on the other side of the EU debate as well. It's also worth bearing in mind that economic forecasting does have a pretty bad record. So, with them actually being so strong in their description of this, like say if we go back here again where it says Britain will be worse off, it's an absolute nonsense. You cannot say that Britain will be worse off by a particular figure in the future, and I'd be amazed if these people didn't actually know that in reality. I think George Osborne in the speech he gave actually tried to defend this when he was questioned by, I think it was Laura Kuenssberg, who pointed out that economic forecasting has a bad track record, and I think he made a kind of appeal to authority, talking about the credibility of the people who've drawn this up. And actually, in this government document itself, it does say that it's an objective analysis, but being objective does not mean that your forecast is going to be correct.